Hello and welcome. My name is Kelvin Wu. I'm with the AWS Cloud Economics Value Benchmarking team. In today's session, we're going to talk about best practices that could help you achieve or maximize the value of the cloud. Now, this presentation is based on a research that we just completed in early 2021 to study the best practices that customers have adopted globally in achieving the value of migration to the cloud. So what do we mean by business value? Well, according to an IDC research in 2018, IDC interviewed a few dozen AWS customers to try to understand the value that they have achieved from migrating to AWS. And they came up with these four different areas of values. What's important to note here, though, is that over 90% of the values comes from the non-TCO or non-cost savings types of benefits. We often hear about cost savings from migrating to the cloud. Yes, that is one of the value of migration, but that's really only 8% of the total value. So we like to think of the value from migration holistically in this context. AWS also has come up with the cloud value framework a few years ago that closely align with these values that IDC had identified. These are cost savings, operational resilience, staff productivity, and business agility. And what this cloud value framework allows us to do is it gave us a really neat and easy way to identify the different areas of the value from the cloud into these four different pillars. And what my team does in value benchmarking is we then use a number of KPIs or key performance indicators that align with each of these areas of the cloud values to help customers measure and benchmark themselves against their relevant peers. So this is really the evolution of what we have done in cloud economics research, and our mission really is to help customers understand the value of the cloud better. And customers have asked us a number of questions as we evolved and mature as an industry and as a market. Initially, a few years ago, customers had questions like, what are the benefits of the cloud, right? I hope that I can save costs, right? Save TCO, reduce TCO, but what else can I expect, right? And that's where we came up with the cloud value framework that you saw in the previous page in helping customers think about the value holistically, not just TCO, but also staff productivity, business agility, and operational resilience as well, right? As we moved on, then customers had a follow-up questions like, well, who else like me has realized value from migration? And how much can I expect, right? That's why we started doing value benchmarking to help customers benchmark and see what the benchmark peers have done in terms of value realization. And the rest of the presentation today is really focusing on the next follow-up questions that we often get from customers. And that is really, how do I go about maximizing these values? Now that I understand what these values are and what the potential of these values are for my organization, how do I actually go about maximizing these or doing it as efficiently or as effectively as possible? That's why we came up with this business value best practices, and these best practices are really what we kept hearing, but we decided to do this research in a quantitative way to really try to measure the impact of these best practices, and I'm happy to share the insights with you today. But before I get into the insights from the research, I just wanted to spend some time talking about the methodology that was used. First of all, this research was a global study that resulted in a global survey of over 700 respondents globally. And this was a multi-phase study in that we started off with phase one, which was a qualitative exploration where we did in-depth interviews with over 30 IT and business leaders to really try to get an understanding from them in terms of what are they doing in their organizations to achieve or to maximize business value. And we took all the input from these organizations into then designing a quantitative survey that was rolled out globally to and in the end, we got 700 respondents from enterprise IT leaders that help us understand where they are. When they answer these survey questions, they assess their organization's maturity in adopting these 45 best practices, as well as a number of other questions such as their industries, their migration, how they migrated, how much of their infrastructure is in the cloud, etc. And all these input allows us to then do phase 3, which is the advanced analysis that allows us to see trends in their responses, in the aggregate responses, but also more importantly, to do advanced data analysis to see correlation between how they adopted these best practices and how they were actually able to achieve values with the cloud, right? And so, like I mentioned earlier, my team focuses on value benchmarking, and we try to help customers understand and benchmark themselves against their most relevant peers. So in order to continue that tradition, we also include a number of KPIs in this best practice study as well, so that we could do this phase 3 advanced analysis and data correlation that I mentioned earlier. And that is something that we want to share with you in subsequent pages. But before we get there, what are these best practices, right? As I mentioned earlier, we have 45 best practices. This is a sample of one best practice. And we don't have time to go into all 45 of them, but they are structured similarly in that there's one best practice, and we ask the respondents to rate their organization's adoption of this particular best practice. In this case, this best practice is about centralized cloud team. And it's always the case that customers have the choice of 1 to 5, with 1 always being the least mature option and 5 being the most mature. And that's also a I don't know option, so that they don't have to guess if they don't really know. And what this allows us to do then is to take all these 45 best practices and we group them into six categories. And this is something that we kept hearing from customers in that there are organizational structural changes that needs to take place. There are best practices for migration that mature organizations need to implement. And what we kept hearing is number 3 here, knowledge and skill sets, right? That's really important to train your employees and have some sort of cross training happening, not just within IT, but also with the businesses too, because there's a lot of uniqueness to the cloud that requires a new level of training and skill set development. And then there are other areas as well, and we'll go through some of them as an example. So the 6 categories here just really help us summarize or synthesize these 45 best practices into manageable groups of categories. So I mentioned that 6 categories earlier. What do the data reveals? What it reveals is, first of all, we just took an aggregate average from the 700 respondents and how they rated their organizations in adopting these best practices, and we just aggregate and took an average. And what you see on the left chart here is that there are these 45 best practices, these 6 categories, I'm sorry, where resilience is an example where most of the organizations seems to have done pretty well, and which is reflected in the highest score here, average score of 4.12. It just means that most of the organizations rated themselves in the 4 and 5 for the best practices that are in the resilience category. But then if we look at the top of this chart here, there are a few categories where the average score is much lower. And these include knowledge and skill set and operational processes. And what this means is just that as a population of the 700 respondents that we survey, they have rooms for improvements, right? It's as suggested by these lower scores, in that there are some that may be doing better, but there are a large number of populations that are not quite there yet in terms of being at the level 4 or level 5, right? That's why we have 3.4 or 3.51 for the first 2 categories of best practices. And then if we want to drill down into the specific best practices that made up each of these categories, we can also do that as well. So the chart that you see on the right here is after drilling down into migration, then you can see the individual best practices. The 7 best practices that made up this group of best practices. And you can see here that at the bottom of the table again, there are a number of things that seem to have wide adoption and high maturity in adopting these. These are security due diligence or performance or security testing. But then as you move up to the top, for example, having a program to incentivize all side of the organization for quick migration, that is something that doesn't seem to have wide adoption yet, and it's one of the best practices that we believe industry should, as a whole, should think about implementing, right? And it's really suggested by the average maturity score of 2.9, which just means that there are a few organizations that are doing it really well. They're at the 4 or 5, but most of them are not quite there yet, right? So this gives us insight as to where they are in terms of best practices that are widely adopted, and some of the best practices that may still need to be adopted by larger number of organizations. And these 700 responses and how they rated themselves on adopting these best practices also allows us to then segment them into low, medium, and high maturity segments. And we saw more insights from doing that, because we in the survey we also asked respondents a number of questions that are qualitative and attitudinal. These and you see a clear trend in that. For example, the low maturity segment customers tend to see cloud or technology as a utility, and they wanted to see a new technology being proven out before they would decide to use that technology. Whereas the high maturity segments are highly innovative, and they recognize the transformative power of technology, and they use it to aggressively innovate and differentiate themselves. So the next page is the one pager that kind of summarizes this whole correlation and advanced data analysis that we have done. So after we segment these customers into low, medium, and high maturity segments, then we took a look at how they fall in terms of value realization or value achievement, right? And we measure that by using these KPIs that I mentioned earlier. These KPIs align with the Cloud Value Framework, and what the data shows from 700 respondents is that there is a correlation between maturity in adopting these best practices and business value realization or KPI improvements, in that you see a linearity from low maturity to high maturity, in that for most of these KPIs, the high maturity segment customers saw larger benefits improvements or larger KPI improvements. For example, in the case of infrastructure spend as a percentage of total IT spend, right? Low maturity customers also happen to have a lot more of their infrastructure still on premises, whereas high maturity segment customers, about 80% of them have their infrastructure already in the cloud. So they see significant cost savings, 11.7% versus almost unchanged for the low maturity segment customers, because a lot of their infrastructure still remains on premises, and in some cases they could actually see costs increase because they now have to manage a hybrid environment of both on-prem and on the cloud. We won't go into all of these KPIs, but you will see that for some of the metrics, the difference is a lot more pronounced between low, medium, and low maturity and high maturity customers. So the actionable takeaway that I wanted to leave with you is really that we have done a detailed quantitative analysis to test out these best practices and And the purpose is really to provide you with a list of the most impactful best practices that you should think about implementing for your organization as you migrate to the cloud. And because these have been proven, as I have shown in the previous page, to correlate with higher benefit achievement or KPI improvements, right? So these are the top four most impactful best practices that we recommend that you implement. The first one being developing a cloud migration roadmap, right? And it's not just having a roadmap and having that reside within IT, but also socializing that across the organization so that we get buy-in and we get participations from both IT and businesses. The second one being a cloud business case. In addition to just looking at the cost of migration or the cost of cloud, why don't we build a more comprehensive business case that included all of the values from the cloud? Remember that previous page that we showed that over 90% of the value comes from non-TCO savings, right? So we are recommending here that you should have a more robust and comprehensive business case that really articulated all the values and costs of migration and how that impacts all the different areas of the organization. Third one being gaining buy-in from executive sponsorship. I know we have heard that a lot in the executive sponsorship for a migration or for any really large initiatives or project is really important, right? And this is particularly important in that we keep hearing and the data shows that those organizations that have strong executive sponsorship and actively participated executives and involvement really makes a difference in their value realization. And lastly, installing a centralized cloud team. Cloud in itself, it just has a lot of uniqueness and differences compared to the traditional way of doing things, such as the traditional on-premises way of procurements or managing on-premises infrastructure is quite different from the cloud. So there needs to be a cloud center of excellence that really understands the uniqueness of the cloud and then actively manage and optimize their cloud environment. So those were the overall best practices that help organizations on a high level. But we also have looked into each of these KPIs that I mentioned earlier and how and what best practices are most impactful in achieving these particular area of the cloud values, right? So, and here we have listed out some of the best practices for targeted improvements. So, for example, if you are interested in cost savings, the most impactful best practice you could adopt is utilizing diverse pricing model, because this goes into talking about being able to forecast or have visibility into your demand, and then manage the pricing models, right? For example, if you have reserve instances or spot instances for some of the steady state demand that your organization has, this could result in 75 to 90% cost savings compared to on-demand pricing. So that is a big difference for a targeted improvement in cost savings, for example. Moving down to the list, for example, business agility. If your organization is interested in improving agility and going to market faster, as an example, then implementing agile methodologies is something that is really impactful in driving that goals that you have in improving your business agility metrics. Another thing that we can do from Cloud Economics is we can work with you to create a customized business value maturity assessment. So we utilize this research that we have done on 700 customers to provide you with a customer report so you can kind of see, for example, on a high level, where you are in terms of maturity score and where your benchmark peer average is. If you are financial services industries, for example, we can pull out just the financial services benchmark average so you can see where you stand. And then we can peel the different layers or drill down into more details too. So from the high level score, we can then look at the 6 different categories of best practices and see where your organization is and where there are gaps. So in this example on the right here in the spider web, you see that there are some areas where there are gaps in between this company's value and the benchmark average, right? So for example, the organizational structure, resilience, development methods, and operating processes are the areas where there are some large gaps, right? And then we can also drill down into each of these categories to the individual best practices that made up each of these categories, and then we can also rank them in terms of where you score your organization at the lowest, or where you have the greatest gap between your organization and the benchmark average, and then we can then prioritize what are some of the best practices, whether it's the top 4, top 5 best practices that you should think about implementing or closing the gap for your organization, right? And tying that back to the previous page, because closing the gap on these best practices or implementing these best practices really correlate with value achievement or KPI improvements. And that's something that we wanted to help our customers with, and we're more than happy to work with you on this. There are additional resources. The research that I just review resulted in this ebook on business value best practices that has now been translated into 12 different languages. I encourage you to take a look. Also, we have the Cloud Economics websites that has a lot more information, a lot more details and resources and customer examples. And there's also an in-depth white paper on the cloud value framework and the benefits of cloud adoptions. So another thing is there is this website that you can review all the other resources that we have from AWS training and certification. Here's my information. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. In the appendix, we have additional breakdown of all of these 45 best practices and more of the raw data from the survey that we have done in this study. And lastly, please take a minute to complete the survey for this session. Thank you so much.